Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, it's been a long time since I've hit up some alternate history. And the kings of alternate history are Alternate History Hub. And this topic really jumped out to me, and it's something I wanted to learn more about and give you some of my thoughts on. And that is, what if Japan had converted to Christianity? So there was a time period when Europeans started showing up into Japan where there were some converts to Christianity coming out of Japan. And some policy and other things basically stopped that dead in its tracks and repelled against it. So I'm interested to see what they have, and I'll add what I know along the way. All right, the original video link is down below, so make sure you're supporting Alternate History Hub. All right, with that, let's get started. Oh, I got plushies. Those are awesome. Oh, that little Roman guy. That'd look good up on my chart or on my shelf.
Two things that sometimes combine. Today, Japan is largely irreligious. In fact, it has one of the largest percentages of atheist people in the world. Temples are frequently visited, but these are largely ceremonial. With all of that said, it seems kind of odd to imagine, but for a brief period of time in the 16th century, Japan's fastest growing religion was Christianity. With the arrival of the Portuguese to Japan, they brought along with them goods, guns, Jesus. Missionaries went on.
Bill Word, shout out, heck yeah. And that happened everywhere Europeans went. You know, there was, you have your traders, and on every ship you got a few Catholic missionaries there ready to do the work
among the people and began teaching the Bible. This was largely tolerated by the Japanese shogun because they were getting trade out of it. The Chinese had banned any trade with Japan, so going through European middlemen kept that porcelain and silk coming in. And also those guns were certainly useful.
You're gonna say that was a huge thing, because for most of the European economies, there wasn't much the Europeans offered that was useful to like China or Japan. Because those had robust, they had robust economies, when a lot of their goods were better quality than Europeans made. But the Portuguese especially were kind of on the cutting edge of gunpowder weaponry. And that is one of the things, like, I'm glad they said there that Japan was really into, as it fit in with their militaristic culture. So yeah, in these early years, they were actually accepting goods. And even unlike China, who really didn't want any goods at all from Europeans, they just wanted cash, right? Silver, gold, and then they would sell you stuff, but they don't want to import things. But Japan actually was importing a small handful of things.
Side effect of this brief toleration was that a prominent minority of Japanese had become devout Catholics, mainly in the south. Cracks began forming.
That's where the trade ports are.
Portuguese traders and Japanese leaders. By the time Japan reunified under the Tokugawa shogunate, the new government had lost patience with this foreign religion. Christianity was seen as subversive, and that's when the crackdowns began.
We also need to look at the historical context, because Japan was also able to witness the exploitation that European nations had on a place like the Philippines, for example, which had just devastated it. And other parts of Europe where you're starting to see them lose their autonomy. Japan did not want to go that route. They want to take control of their destiny here.
If you're familiar with early Christian history, you know the drill. Persecution, martyrdom, the classic 200 AD stuff. Thanks to this, along with general discontent with the government, there was a rebellion primarily of Christians in the south. Peasants took up the cross, prophecies were foretold, and spoilers, it didn't end up well. I'm going to be honest, this video was directly inspired by a recent Kings and Generals video about the Shimabara Rebellion. I'm going to try to avoid stepping on this video's toes as much as I can. So if you want the full context of Christianity in Japan, watch this video first and then come back. If you just want a brief idea though, there was Christianity in Japan until there wasn't. But what if somehow Christianity didn't stop rising? What if Japan had largely became Christian?
Cool. Good. This is like he was going to get into, but one of the things that was, I guess, a complaint or some kind of grievance against Christianity in Japan, especially by the government, was the fear of a lack of loyalty to the Japanese emperor, and just Japanese, mostly like the emperor, but Japanese government as well, especially amongst Catholics, because of their sort of reverence to the Pope. So like there was a fear that, again, maybe Japanese Christians could find themselves, when torn, being more loyal to the Pope than to the emperor. And that was just something, you know, unacceptable. That's the thing. That's the thing that I often gets talked about in history curriculums. Was that, but there's so much more to it. They see just the Western influence there, and again the context of exploitations that Europeans have been doing for a long time. But yeah, it does not go well, and it looks like he wasn't gonna say it, but they I mean, there was this war. They ended up slaughtering Christians. They yeah, it was very violent and physically and violently eradicated it. Or at least
Thanks
pushed
to
it
the
underground.
Portuguese, Nagasaki and southern Japan quickly became a hub of Christian activity.
Right.
Like followers in the hundreds of thousands, even samurai and daimyo were
It grew
becoming
really
converts.
fast.
Japan had recently been unified under the Tokugawa shogunate.
One of the first
Under
times ever.
shogunate, Christianity was subversive against the culture and stability of Japan. You're not loyal to the emperor when you're loyal to the pope, which, you know, that's kind of true. This wasn't the only reason though. Missionaries were loud. They had no regard for Japanese cultural traditions.
You see that
and
everywhere.
They were even having converts desecrate temples and Shinto icons. So upon hearing that the Spanish and Portuguese had colonies across the world, the Japanese feared that they might be next. The thing is, it's an uphill battle.
And it's a very legitimate fear, looking at what was going on.
For Christianity no matter what. There are a few factors that need to happen for Christianity to even have a chance to grow in this alternate timeline. 1. There is no Shimabara rebellion. That was one of the final straws that broke the camel's back for the shogun. The Europeans were immediately blamed and trade was cut off, for the most part. But 2, there would be no Shimabara rebellion if there's no Tokugawa shogunate. Now, imagining Japan without the Tokugawa.
I mean, the Tokugawa were truly setting out to create a culturally unified Japan, which just had not happened in Japanese history. Japanese history has always been one of more like city states and clan style governments, and it's been extremely difficult. The Tokugawa did that, and that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to set out one culturally unified Japan, and it kind of oppressive ways too. They really were forcing it there. Now, it did create what a lot of people consider like a Japanese golden age, starting around the 1600s. But it does tail off by the time Westerners start showing up again, say in the mid-19th century with the Americans.
Tokugawa pretty much changes the last 500 years of Japanese history. This was a period of unity and isolation that kind of really did help Japan. They had
You say 500 years because it was not 500 years.
Of unity and isolation that kind of really did help. Japan without the Tokugawa pretty much changes the last 500 years of Japanese history. This was a period of unity and isolation that kind of really did help Japan. They had
a couple hundred years of isolation. They blocked themselves off from Westerners almost completely, except for the little, if you've heard about the little exception of allowing a Dutch ship here and there in one port, you know.
2 centuries of total peace. For Christianity to spread, we might have to imagine.
By the way, can we please make a rule?
Centuries
Hold on.
of total peace.
I gotta show you this. Okay. This bugs me about maps. The darker color should be the land, the lighter color should be water. Tell me if I'm wrong here. Let me know down in the comments. This seems inverted to me. Okay, that's just a thing I've always felt about maps.
To spread, we might have to imagine that this warring states period simply continues on far longer than in our timeline.
Well, let me digest that. That's what he's saying. If there's not this rebellion, the warring states period doesn't happen, or it keeps happening. So that Tokugawa never come into power?
Another century, because if Japan isn't able to unify as quickly, they have far less of a united front against outside forces, and in this case, religion. Now you might say...
Or just, I guess, maybe the fact that unity was very difficult because there would be this division, I guess, cultural divisions there. I mean, I guess they're saying that Tokugawa would never... Tokugawa could still come into power, may not have the cultural unity through religion like they're saying there.
The emperor still exists. Wouldn't they do something to stop this? Well, the emperor was much more of a figurehead.
Yeah, emperor has
without any prominent military power,
the shoguns.
They'd kind of be powerless to enforce any ban on Christendom. What I'm saying here is that without a central authority, the Catholics have free reign to influence the island. Oh, Cody, is that what's gonna happen here too? Well, while 9 times out of 10, I would probably say that this ends in some alternate divvying up between colonial powers, I'm not so sure that's the case here. In this alternate timeline,
I mean, Japan can still, in this scenario, still, and their government still defend against foreign rule. They can adopt some things and preserve some things. I mean, they've done that historically for millennia with China, which is take what you want, but preserve your autonomy. I mean, they could still potentially do that, especially if Japan had still been importing, modern weaponry and things like that and be able to maybe defend itself a little better. I think they could still do that.
does Japan suddenly become a Portuguese colony? Does it fall to the same fate as China
No.
because it didn't shut
Not
itself off from the
necessarily.
rest of the world? Well, no. And that's because of a few things.
I agree.
One, Japan really just wasn't worth colonizing. Japan was too well defended and advanced to even attempt a hostile takeover.
That's true.
Two, Japan, especially during the Warring States period, had become masters of warfare and adept at picking up European weapons, reverse engineering them, and building their own. I mean, it took 200 years of isolation and an industrial revolution in the West for the Japanese to even become concerned by the outside world.
Yeah, they're not going to get out technologied for 2 centuries.
So we continue on to
And maybe if they had this relationship, they would have industrialized at the same time as maybe, or much earlier than they did. Even though Japan was the first Asian nation to industrialize, in this timeline, they could have done it much sooner as well and maintain their autonomy even further.
alternate 1600s. Christianity spreads and becomes an actual cultural force with more and more daimyos converting. What becomes simply a divide between rivals becomes a divide between religions and cultures. The Warring States period blends into a new conflict over faith. Whether or not the Christian daimyos may win,
Makes sense.
I cannot say. For the sake of time, think of this like Rome, where Christians were a minority of the population and persecuted until they weren't, and suddenly the state is Christian. And hey, perhaps they can even keep
There's
their
more
emperor.
reasons than that,
Take
but
a
yeah.
formerly native idea and translate it for the population to better accept. The emperor is not simply ordained by the sun goddess Amaterasu, but by, God. While it might seem like a stretch, if the Christian population becomes big enough, this might be the way that the emperor might go. What type of Christianity there would be in Japan really depends on how tolerated the Portuguese are.
Well, like if you're doing the Rome comparison, I mean, if the emperor was to whatever reason convert to Christianity, I mean, that would change the history. I mean, that's kind of what happened when you get like Constantine, and then further on, it can take one high-end convert to change the landscape.
The shoguns liked the Dutch because they didn't push their faith.
Exactly.
But with no shoguns and a very persistent Portuguese, those Jesuit missionaries would be the main influence of Christianity the Japanese would get, not
Right.
Dutch Protestantism.
Right, because like they were saying, the Dutch weren't as into the conversion stuff. Far more aggressive conversions were happening amongst Catholicism.
An important thing here
Around
is
the
that
world.
even if there is eventually another unified shogunate, they simply don't have the influence to stamp out all of Christianity like they were able to in our timeline, and it only grows from there.
Makes sense, because just the numbers would have been
Japan for
bigger,
quite some time
and they would have probably had more support from like Portugal, or maybe even Spain starts crossing over the line of demarcation, coming over to Japan.
was believed to
Pope
be
gets
massive.
involved, all that.
And while Japan is big compared to Europe, about the size of the US West Coast, it isn't nearly as big as they believed. In fact, there was somewhat of a fascination in this early relationship between the Catholic world and Japan. Japan was a mystical land that Portugal and Spain believed was prime for conversion. It wasn't until the shogun spat that idea down that relations became more openly hostile. Let's imagine that, just like Rome, Japan converts. Japan historically has been pretty homogenous compared to other civilizations.
Extremely homogeneous.
The only infighting that ever really
But also the homogeneity, did I say that right? Was also because of the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa forced a homogenous society upon Japan, and you wouldn't have had that as much without the Tokugawa.
happened was between who would be the ultimate shogun under the emperor, or to kick out
was like the
Ainu
Christian
from
shogun
north.
and then the
Socially
Shinto
and culturally,
shogun.
there was never much division. Yet with the introduction of Christianity, this brings in a cultural new division that Japan never had before. Daimyos, samurai, and peasants now could be divided between worldviews. Those former pagan idols and ideas are either wiped out
I love
or
those
slapped
arches.
with Christian paint. Much like the last samurai of our own timeline, those that refuse to adopt Christianity probably create a new refuge on Hokkaido, the last remnant of an old Japan. Buddhist and Shinto
Because the south, because it really went from the south and went up north. Interesting. You get like different islands, like the Christian island and the still the native Shinto religion or something.
thinking molds the theology in new hotbeds of Eastern Christian thought like Nagasaki and Osaka. Without the Tokugawa, Edo, now Tokyo, never becomes the center of Japanese politics. It's very
Stays in
likely
Kyoto.
Kyoto remains the capital, both politically and eventually religiously. It may truly become a blend between Eastern and Western thought, even down to, well, the writing style. In Catholicism, regardless of your language, Latin up until Vatican II was the language of Mass. Japanese churches would speak and write to discuss theology in Latin, and from that, it's possible this leads to more acceptance of the Latin alphabet, while never outright replacing their
But no, not the language. Nobody was speaking it.
own writing system of characters and kanji, perhaps even creating an alternate Latinized Japanese system. We first saw this actually with the Nippo Jisho, a translation of 30,000 words from Japanese to Portuguese for the sake of converting peasants. Had the religion never been banned and Christian documents destroyed, Portugal would have been Japan's window to the Western world. Now, from a traditionalist Japanese perspective, this all sounds horrifying. First, a foreign faith comes in, then the emperor changes from the descendant of a god to simply blessed by God.
We don't know if necessarily, a emperor would convert, but just saying there. If it's like the Constantine way, then is it a conversion based off of just trying to appeal to this massive people, or like a true faith conversion that way? But I guess you might say the longer Christianity goes to Japan, the more likely then that one of these emperors would convert, whether it's again for faith reasons or to create an alliance with the West.
To now Latin itself taking over. That's a lot to take in. But this is something that is repeated multiple times throughout history. A new religion will come in, upend the old, and society, even down to the writing style, will transform. As dramatic as changing the writing style sounds, keep in mind before the 20th century, most people didn't really write. It was a tool for the elite.
This dude writing with two hands, dick. He's like he unlocked the achievement for Bible literacy,
So
Bible
we're talking
writing.
about the 1% no longer writing in a similar style. Yet, if there is a new positive that the
Don't like that
Japanese
map.
would
I
see
don't like that
gained
map.
from this conversion, it would be a new connection to the West. They would not be exploited by colonial powers. This would be an equal relationship. And the effect of this
I do
is
think the more equal relationship, definitely more than some of the other places where this happened.
it changes early modern Europe's view on Japan. This would be a Christian kingdom on the other side of the world, something that we never really saw in our timeline.
True.
While that period of isolation was great for the country internally, it also soured any positive notes Europe previously had towards Japan. Then by the time Americans rolled up in their gunboats, any form of
Harry's boat.
respect that was seen between the Western world and Japan had been pretty much forgotten. And
Yeah, that
by
wouldn't
that
even
time,
happen.
we had scientific racism. I
Oh,
don't want to get
great.
demonetized, but I will bring up the racial aspect to this. What
Some social
determined
Darwinism
the
going on
other
here.
for exploration era Europeans wasn't simply race, but faith. Yes, different phenotypes existed and people looked different, but what mattered most was whether or not they followed Jesus or not. Faith evolved into views on civilization, and soon onto views of race, which is why when the Japanese were originally flirting with the idea of Christianity, they were depicted as more closer to Europeans.
see
But
that.
by the time of Matthew Perry, they were seen as the yellow other. I know it sounds weird, but faith was the original basis for early European racism on what is civilized or not. As much as Japan is losing that aspect of its natural identity, Europe frankly
But I do wonder where they would put Japanese in that hierarchy of that racial hierarchy that they went by there. Probably seen as, yeah, like a higher level of it. Less, you would use terms like savage and stuff like that, since this civilization is really defending itself well and was adopting a lot of Western ways. They probably wouldn't have put them as far down that hierarchy.
Lee has a far greater relationship with Japan if they had adopted Christianity in the 17th century. What can I say? People historically have gotten along with others that have similar beliefs. Ain't that shocking?
Yeah, isn't that weird how that works?
Imagine a Japan that keeps up to date with technological advancements in military warfare from the 1600s onto the 1860s.
Yeah, it'd be the most advanced non-European Christian country.
Always going to modernize, but it just so happens that in this alternate timeline, it's a lot more gradual instead of over the span of a generation. While I know some of you clicked on this video imagining crusading samurai or Catholic Japanese soldiers fighting in the 30 Years' War, I'm sorry to be a bummer, but this couldn't really be the case. Keep in mind, Japan's Warring States period ended officially in 1615. It shut itself off from the world in 1603. Now, religion can spread fast, but it needs a few generations to stick. That's why I gave this a century-long window.
Islam, I'd say different.
For Christianity to realistically spread among the peasantry. So even if Japan did end up adopting Catholicism after all of this, it'd still be by the early 1700s that they would unify. Not really a time of crusading samurai anymore. In fact, Japan largely skips the real bloodshed of the Protestant Reformation. Portugal, which in this timeline would be Japan's greatest connection to Europe,
that mostly already happened by then.
By the Dutch. There's a few ways I can imagine this interaction playing out. The Japanese, while Christian, are so far removed from the politics of Europe that they'd rather trade with the West for Chinese goods more than anything else, maintaining a friendly relationship with the Dutch regardless of faith. Or there is a swell of newfound Catholic zeal birthed by this new conversion, making Japan late to the party when it came to religious wars, at least compared to a Europe that got all of that out of its system.
I see what they were saying earlier, though, with the Protestant Reformation thing, because the hostility between Catholics and Protestants after the beginning of the Reformation was so hostile that since Protestantism would have only had probably a very small footprint actually in Japan, you would have had like your own 30 Years' War or something like that in Japan.
For the sake of picking one, I'm going to lean towards the Japanese disliking the Dutch, which is ironic considering how much they like them in our own timeline. This newfound hatred has
maybe not so much though, because the Dutch were not proselyting. And probably would have even been less likely to proselyte at that time. That wasn't their deal.
Nothing to do with religious
they're traitors.
It's mainly politics. Mostly. In this alternate timeline, I can see it being very possible that Japan develops a good relationship with Spain. Thanks to centuries of trade, Japan would already be familiar with the Portuguese and the Spanish Philippines, who are the next close.
But they would be. The Portuguese wouldn't have liked that. The Portuguese would not have liked that. You had line of demarcation. The sides had agreed to stay away from each other's hemispheres. Yes, with the exceptions being Spain, with the Philippines, because they were already early in there with Magellan, and then with the Portuguese in Brazil. That would have crossed a bunch of long-standing agreements going back to the 1490s. That could have brought a lot of drama if the Spanish were involved there and tried to spread outside of their colony in the Philippines, though.
Closest connection to Christendom the converted Japanese would have. The problem for Japan when it comes to these European empires is they kind of backed the wrong horse. No amount of Japanese conversions were going to save Portugal and Spain from falling into irrelevancy. It's likely that by the time Japan rises as a power, wars eventually stop being waged purely over religion and more over markets and colonies. Moving on to other things, a failed invasion of Korea was also what led to that period of isolation. Instead of Korea being annexed in a 19th century world, it's instead slowly conquered and colonized by an ever-growing Japanese population. Hey, maybe it's Japan's new mission to convert the Koreans. Just as the
in a lot of ways, maybe the Japanese era of imperialism would not have changed much. I could see that happening, still them being aggressive. Well, especially when industrialization begins. When industrialization begins, Japan had to start leaving their island for resources and things like that. So would it have happened earlier now? I mean, maybe.
Were pushed from northern Japan until the island was homogenized. This peninsula soon becomes another part of the Japanese realm. Its people pushed to Manchuria if they're not entirely assimilated. Japan without isolation just colonizes
Map is still
slower,
killing me.
and because of that, their influence in East Asia has a longer lasting effect.
Ocean is not red.
Generations upon generations of Japanese domination. And throughout this whole time, Japan is still fighting alternate skirmishes and wars with European powers. Just as every nation at some point fought from the 18th to 20th centuries, so would Japan, but never truly falling to any power. Even with slightly improved military technology.
Why would, I mean, depending, it might be lost in their timeline here when they're talking about when would this have happened? Just the British would have been pushing in. I mean, Japan being so divided up later, again, largely in part of the Americans coming in the mid 19th century of breaking that barrier down, the isolation, and then forcing them, all the other Western European nations, to be able to trade with them too. So I don't know if this would be happening like that.
I can't imagine Japan could just strong arm the Qing into opening up. The Qing was at their height of power in the early 1700s. If Japan wanted to exploit that, they might have to wait until the next century, like everyone else. Personally, I don't think Japan was ever going to conquer the Pacific. If they did, they would be competing against the Dutch East India Company for Indonesia, as well as turning against the Spanish for the Philippines. I think they'd be more interested in colonizing a bit further north, while also maintaining good relations with Europeans. Unluckily for Japan, it just so happens that their new rival wouldn't be from Europe. Thanks to its location on the globe and sharing an ocean with the United States, in time there was always going to be some clash between these two. Japan is still a power that would rival the US in the Pacific, so it's inevitable that they would come to blows. It's possible that instead of some massive Pacific war, Japan and the US fight in a smaller conflict over a few islands, maybe the Philippines. It's an interesting possibility that
maybe, but that was a result of the Spanish-American War with the Philippines, not anything to do with Japan. So what would the cause of conflict be between the Japanese and the Americans? I guess it depends on the timeline that way.
Japan may still be
I don't
allies
think
with
about that more.
Spain and help it hold out against the Americans when the time comes. This alternate Spanish-American war may evolve into the Spanish-Japanese and American War, which is a far more costly endeavor for the US trying to get into the empire business. Not
only if Japan was interested more in the Pacific rather than like Korea. Like the Americans, they're not going to try to compete for mainland Asia, I would not think.
Not really a splendid little war like it was in our timeline.
It truly changed.
In the slimmest possibility that somehow Japan was able to convert to Christianity, it would largely be a societal change for Japan more than anything on the global stage. Even in the best possible scenario, Japan following a true conversion to Christianity still sees the turmoil that changing religions does for a civilization. The old order is destroyed or adopted in some way. Political clans and structures are at best weakened and at worst toppled. Japan's isolation actually did do a fair amount of good. It missed out on an age of enlightenment, sure, but it also missed the instability that came with it. And by the time Japan no longer could ignore the outside world, they adapted without missing a beat.
The Tokugawa period was very positive, at least for a couple hundred years.
While Japan does become more respected by the European empires because of their conversion, this is saying very little. European empires hated one another for the pettiest of reasons, and Japan wouldn't escape this regardless of faith. By the time they really do unify, it would be after religious faith for Europe kinda didn't matter anymore. Japan reinvented itself and rebuilt its society from the ground up to become a Catholic nation, only for its Catholic allies to basically bite the dust. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
All right, let's wrap it up. I love that these videos kind of get you thinking. I love that. I don't think we do that enough as historians. Is think about different outcomes. We talk so much about what has happened, and need to talk probably more about what could have happened. And a lot of it, again, is still conjecture, but it's a lot of fun to do. And it's also nice when you can look at similar situations around the world and be able to like use them as evidence so you have an informed opinion. That's always great. Like to do alternate history, you have to know history already, and you have to know lots of history so you can have examples, you have something to compare it to, compare and contrast. But this one was a great one, and you know, if you followed with me, thank you so far. You'll see there were a lot of things I agreed with. There were some other things I didn't wrap my head around, or at least did not buy into completely. And that's what's fun about alternate history, is you can do that, and I appreciate that. So it was fun to get back to Alternate History Hub. I hope you enjoyed what's going on here. If this is the first of Alternate History Hub commentary videos you've seen from me and you want to see more, I'll be linking them right now around me. You'll start seeing the tiles, the video tiles pop up, and yeah, you can check those out because I've covered a bunch of them. Some really interesting ones, like, you know, World War I and World War II. What if, you know, those had gone differently? So, all right, with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.